I'm gonna.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Accessible to Whom Recommendations for Equitable Green Schoolyards. My name is Sarah Coles, and I am the Executive Director of Texas Children and Nature Network, and I am excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session. Thank you so much for joining us. To save bandwidth for our attendees and for a clean recording, we ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation. I'll be monitoring the chat so you can share your questions there, and I'll share them with the presenter. Please remember to keep your comments in the chat kind. Khadija is running tech for us today. Thank you so much, Khadija. As I said, we're recording this session, and I'll share the recording in a follow-up email. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and then private message Khadija with your name for our attendance. Also, if your Zoom name doesn't match the name you registered with, please change your name using the three little dots next to it, or let us know. And if you need a certificate and we don't have your name, we won't be able to provide that certificate. And just a reminder, if you're needing a certificate, you'll need to follow the directions that were in the email with this Zoom link. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children and Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on Indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through Texas Children and Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. And in just a minute, I'm going to put some links about land acknowledgements in those people groups in the chat. But now I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speaker today, Janice Haggerman. She has been working with Texas Children and Nature Network and CCCN Austin for a number of years on green schoolyards and is going to be sharing some of her work. So thank you so much for joining us today, Janice, and take it away.
Yay. Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I will be presenting my thesis work from my graduate program. Um, I'll share my screen and talk a little bit more about where I'm coming from. Okay. Sorry, just give me one second. There it is. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so like Sarah said, my name is Janice, and I started working with Sarah and the Texas Children and Nature Network back in 2024. Sarah contracted me as a graduate research assistant at UT Austin to do some research for some advocacy materials for green schoolyards in Austin, in Texas in general. Those resources do exist on the TCINN website. I'll drop them in the chat at the end of the session. Um, but yeah, I'm a former grad student. I graduated in May with my master's in urban planning and in public affairs. Um, and the way that I came to Green Schoolyards research as an independent grad student was through the research that I did for Sarah, creating advocacy materials for people creating or maintaining green schoolyards and who needed a little bit of support to advocate for their projects. So, oh, thank you, Sarah. So, as an urban planning student, what has always been compelling to me, and I guess now as a practitioner searching for a place to practice, what's always been compelling to me is the position of schools in communities as not only as community assets, but as places where students and adults and community members interact inside and outside of the school day, and how we kind of have an understanding of what schools can offer in terms of urban planning. A lot of times people talk about schools as sort of crisis centers for if there's an emergency or resource hubs. But on the day-to-day, we can, as planners, see schools as opportunities to mitigate certain problems or challenges in communities, such as lack of green space. So, green schoolyards can act as strategy to expand green space or park space in a neighborhood where there's not a lot of existing green space in the first place. But for me, what I'm always curious about is what are the people who are in these spaces that we're planning saying about these spaces? How do people feel about the things that we've built? How do people feel about it before? Are we talking to people enough about what they want to see in their community? And I, as someone who loves working with kids and has always worked with kids in various capacities, am particularly interested in what kids think about spaces, especially those that are purportedly designed for children. So green schoolyards are kind of like right in the middle of all of that, where we have students who are forced to be in these spaces that are like, designed for them and designed hopefully to be inviting spaces for them. And then as proponents of nature and children's connection to nature, everyone here, how are these resources that are green schoolyards that, exist in Austin and exist in Texas and elsewhere, what are the kids saying about them? So I think the last piece of context that I'll add is that um, this presentation will relate specifically to environmental justice concerns regarding green schoolyards. So how does equity play into all this? Um, all right. So I'm just going to give a really brief overview. I know that everyone here pretty much has uh, probably a working definition of green schoolyards, but I'm just going to move this a little bit. Okay, there we go. The main things that I want to highlight on this slide have to do with the context that I'm approaching my research question with. So, as the background context, the Children and Nature Network defines green schoolyards as nature-filled outdoor spaces that offer students, teachers, parents, and community members places to play, learn, explore, and grow. And in order to have a working definition of nature filled and so like what constitutes a green schoolyard, especially in this context of equity, what I thought was important to highlight is that not every green schoolyard is going to be a pocket prairie or um, a meadow with a bioswale and, trees and shade and stuff like that. Sometimes a green schoolyard is one nature-based amenity that has been intentionally placed on a school campus for the facilitation of children's interaction with nature. So you can think like a planter in a parking lot, or maybe like a fish pond in like the middle of a walkway. And I think that there's a lot of further questioning and research that has been done and that should be done regarding like how much nature does a kid need to be connected to nature? I think, that's a valuable question for all of us to be asking. But for the context of this research, I think it's important to identify that if someone, staff, parent, other fellow student has seen that their campus is devoid of nature and they put nature in a space and then other students are able to interact with that in some way, that counts at least towards a green schoolyard. And then everyone here, I'm sure, is already familiar with the benefits of basically kids being outside, but in the context of schools. And these points allude back to those advocacy materials that we were talking about earlier, basically like compelling reasons to get folks to care about putting nature in a schoolyard, include, improved physical and mental health outcomes, increased social emotional learning capacity, which tends to be the most compelling for people particularly concerned with or preoccupied with learning outcomes. If something needs to have an associated learning outcome, that can be very compelling. Higher academic achievements in terms of grades. Nature-based amenities can improve the infrastructural sustainability of a campus in terms of flooding and extreme heat. And then, like I was saying earlier, green schoolyards can provide neighborhood access to green space in a place that otherwise doesn't necessarily have a lot of access to existing green space. So, just to give a little bit of an outline for how I'm approaching my equity question, which I will give another overview of in the next slide, what I think is important to note before getting too deep into the research is to say that um, my capacity as a grad student for this project was limited to doing a case study of two green schoolyards in Austin because um, I didn't have the resources or capacity to survey all of the green schoolyards that exist in Austin. And even at that point, compared to the existing green schoolyards in Texas, AISD wouldn't have been a big enough sample size to be able to make statistical conclusions about green schoolyards as a whole in Texas. Instead, how I'm approaching this is as a program evaluation. So, using mixed methods and unique data types, how can we, as planners and really as anyone sort of looking to institute systems change in their organization or network, use existing case studies to kind of create a logic model that examines if you're achieving what you seek to achieve. So, in the case of green schoolyards, my design logic model, which I'd be happy to talk about more at the end if folks have questions or ideas about how this logic model might look differently for like what is the point of a green schoolyard. I would argue that a green schoolyard uses green infrastructure inputs. So, like I was saying before, nature instituted anywhere on campus. Maybe that's outdoor seating with shade. Maybe that's an outdoor learning area. Or maybe that's just the track, because that is outside. Um, and these inputs give way to activities that students and community members outside of school, maybe, or even adults, teachers at the school are able to use during class time, gym class, or during recreational time. And so we would hope that with these activities, we're able to achieve engagement as an output. Like people are spending time outside. When you go on the track during gym, you're outside. Again, a good question about, you know, is that enough? Probably not, but it's something. So, given that engagement as it exists, students hopefully are, ch enjoying that, choosing to go outside, and so connecting with nature. And then ultimately, we know that connection with nature has improved public health impacts. So, this is sort of really like an idealistic model of how a green schoolyard might affect impacts down the road. Typically, with relation to program evaluations, impacts are really squishy and hard to measure, but that's why this is sort of like ideally, this is why we would advocate for a green schoolyard because it makes students healthy in all of these ways. So, this is sort of the model that I'm approaching this with, where again, like there's no replicable conclusion that I can say about green schoolyards as a field, as a whole, but we can make some observations about these particular places and how the green schoolyards are working out for them in Austin. So my research question overall is, given that in my research as an environmental planner, I know, and it's seen in the research as listed here, that low-income communities of color lack access to park, green spaces, and nature statistically. And in addition, youth of color, so youth who tend to be typically in low-income communities, especially, are excluded from opportunities to engage in planning and environmental planning. So given that not basically essentially like non-white affluent communities have less of a say or less of a voice or are encouraged to participate less in planning opportunities and also um, tend to have less access to green space. How do the green spaces that exist for those communities work out? Right? Like if nature-based amenities exist, so if there are green schoolyards all over AISD, are students accessing them equitably? Is the green schoolyard on one campus being engaged in the same way that a green schoolyard is on another campus across demographic groups? And what do the kids have to say about them? What do the users have to say about them? And this is really based in this idea that I have seen in my work and in research that access is not the same thing as engagement. So you can put a green schoolyard or you can put like a basketball court, you can put any, you can use any example, a computer lab, something for students to use. And just because it is there doesn't mean that they're going to use it. It takes training, it takes kind of coached utilization. You have to bring people in, but then after you leave, like after you're able to show folks like this is what you can do in this space, not only do they are they do they feel like they have agency to go use the space, but are they able to act on that agency? If they want to go use it, are they allowed to? Like, what are the kind of like fallout circumstances that happen after that implementation? And what can students say about that? That's really my question. So, as a little bit of context to kind of set up this research, I think it's important to note AISD's demographic makeup, which is to say that AISD is a Hispanic serving institution like the University of Texas at Austin. So this research question is well suited for AISD because this phenomenon is likely to occur in this medium. And in addition, for context, the managers or the sort of people who I was taking my cues from for what Green Schoolyards sort of existed in AISD were the sort of list of folks who have multiple roles or singular roles or just sort of a hand in managing green schoolyards in the AISD. And I think this list is also important to note for folks who are not in AISD as a district. And it's to say that in a similar way to instituting nature in an urban setting, anyone can be a green schoolyard manager. You can be a teacher, a student, a parent, an administrator. In the case of AISD, the Parks and Recreation Department's Cities Connecting Children to Nature program did a lot of facilitating of initiating green schoolyard projects, maintaining them. And then in the context of AISD as a district, when we got the bond in 2022 to modernize a handful of schools, it was a requirement associated with the modernization projects that the campuses had architectural teams, so sort of community engagement teams that would work with parents, with staff, with students and families to talk about the modernization plans. And in the case of green schoolyards, outdoor learning is operational in it is listed in the education specifications for modernized schools in AISD. So it's a priority, right? But how that works out sort of depends on the campus architectural team, but and then the project developer and architect and planner and stuff like that. So given that it's a specification, that should be a priority for these groups. So in terms of methods, again, relating to the program evaluation model, I chose two existing green schoolyards in Austin. The only difference between the two schools was their demographics. I chose two middle schools. I wanted to be able to have focus groups. I was able to have focus groups, but I wanted to be able to have conversations with students who were older than elementary school students, but younger than high school students. So kind of in between that, like, you know, feeling or discovering being outside and then like not being able to really have time to go outside maybe as much as they would want in high school. So I felt that middle schoolers were sort of in between that sort of transitional phase of like moving away from recreational time, moving towards um, sort of a more serious approach to like academics and recreation and stuff like that, but older than elementary school students. So these two middle schools had similar property sizes, similar expanses of green space. Their population sizes were similar, and they both had outdoor learning areas. Um, but whereas one school was in West Austin and was over 50% white, and a quarter of their students were enrolled in a free lunch program, School B in Northeast Austin is 92% Hispanic, and over half are enrolled in a free lunch program. So, sort of capturing that socioeconomic, racial, demographic in order to sort of see how, given the knowledge that we have about demographically induced disparities in access to nature, how that's sort of playing out into spaces that currently are meant to be sort of bridging that divide with these nature-based amenities. So I was able to recruit two adults for the focus groups for School A and six for School B, or sorry, 7 adults for school B, and then 6 for school A and 10 for school B. I will say, for the methods, it was a lot easier to recruit for focus groups in the school that was in Northeast Austin because there are very engaged parent groups. It's a very engaged campus, and a lot of campuses in East Austin have very engaged community groups, parent groups, advocacy groups working to make their campus a better space for their students. The focus groups were held outside. Luckily, the weather was really nice. This was, I will also say, about 11 months ago. These focus groups occurred. So a little bit less than a year outside of the present context. We talked about engagement, so whether or not students and adults in their separate discrete focus groups were using the space and in what ways. We talked about whether or not they use the space as a park space outside of school, since that's sort of, again, like the purported benefit of a green schoolyard is that, oh, this is a usable space outside of school. And then we talked about participatory design, which is a concept in planning that that is relates to whether or not people using a space are able to have a hand in designing it. So again, as a little bit of context just for folks outside of Austin, I-35 divides the city into East and West Austin. These maps sort of overlay the demographic um, discrepancies that have occurred as a result of gentrification in East Austin, where on the left you see the percentage of not white non-Hispanic people is majority West Austin. And then the majority Hispanic population is in East Austin. And then on the right, most of Austin's income is concentrated to the west. So one of the schools, School A, was in West Austin and School B was in East Austin. So in terms of what came of the focus groups, this is a text-heavy slide, but it's comparable across each column. I'm just going to take a break real quick. So across each of these focus group discussion points, a few major themes came out. So the way that I did this was we had focus groups, and then I recorded the transcripts of each focus group and then coded for themes. So these are the themes that came out of those conversations. The first, which was true across both schools, was an enthusiasm for outdoor sports infrastructure. The kids love sports across both schools. Um, there are basketball courts at both campuses and tracks, and both are widely enjoyed by the student population. Um, from there, things differentiated pretty quickly, where in School A, in West Austin, the students were allowed to eat lunch outdoors. There were picnic tables in the front of the campus, and students were allowed to eat lunch during their lunch period. Students in School B were not allowed to eat lunch outside. There were some picnic tables behind the school, but not an expanse of picnic tables in front of the school for the lunch period. In School A, students were allowed to use the outdoor classroom alone. Students talked about going to feed chickens between classes and spend time to just chill in the outdoor space before or after school. Whereas at School B, students were not allowed to use the outdoor classroom outside of class. And at School A, students felt like these opportunities that they had to go outside were because they were trusted to be there. Whereas at School B, students felt and heard that they're not trusted to be outside. And I came to understand this difference in conversations with students about what would happen if basically somebody got in trouble while they were outside. So in School A, students said that if they leave the outdoor lunch area a mess, that teachers and administrators will associate the problem with the people who left their trash outside, and those specific people might not be allowed to go outside during the next lunch period. Whereas at School B, if something happened during like gym class, or an outdoor learning period because of one person, the whole class would not be allowed to go outside the next time. So I saw this difference between the discipline of the individual at school A and the discipline of the group at school B, sort of using um, outdoor access as kind of um, a, the lack of access as a punishment in school B. And we know in this group that access to nature should never be um, necessarily, it's a privilege, but it shouldn't be withheld. It's known to have um, benefits for behavioral problems when students are allowed to go outside. So to use to remove access to outdoor time as a result of a behavioral problem is counterintuitive, as we know in this group of advocates. Um, Related to park space, there were pretty similar feedback narratives in terms of whether or not students felt like their schoolyard was park-like. There's a lot of research on what students want in a park or a playground, but I thought this question was particularly salient again for the middle school demographic, where these kids who were, 12, 11 to 13 still we're talking about like, well, there's no playground at my school, so it's not a park. And I appreciated their candor there because I think it's important, at least for me, to remember that um, even, going into the tween years, students still feel like recreation is a big part of spending time outside, recreation on playgrounds. Um, so when I asked if students were able to go where they found um, places to spend time outside. At school A, students were able to visit other parks, whereas at school B, there were not other available green spaces in that neighborhood. So that goes back to sort of what we were talking about in terms of um, folks in communities of color and or low income communities tending to not have as much access to green space. So if they weren't at school, the folks at school B were not um, going able to sort of within a reasonable distance, which for planning is within a 15-minute walk, find other green spaces. Whereas at school A, folks were able to do that. In terms of participatory design, no one was on the CAT team in school A. In school B, the one of the main adult participants in the focus group was on the campus architectural team, but considering that the mandate is for a highly visible community engagement team for modernizations, I was that was a big takeaway was that there was not a lot of recognition of the opportunity to be on the campus architectural team. I also asked if folks knew how the spaces at their schools were planned in the past, if there was any knowledge of a prior planning initiative, and no one at either school knew about that. And the last thing that was drastically different between schools was at school A, in general, students and other end users were satisfied with the school's current state. They were happy with the picnic tables, happy with the shade trees. They felt like their sports infrastructure was well maintained, whereas at school B, people spoke openly about how the schoolyard's current state was broken, especially the picnic tables. There were big swaths of empty fields with nothing in them, and there was poorly maintained sports infrastructure. This is an example of the infrastructural differences between school A and school B. Students talked at school A about enjoying the big open space. This is where they would eat lunch and would enjoy eating lunch outside. Whereas at school B, students were pretty verbose about how the tables hidden behind the school were dirty. They felt like they were hidden away and not available for use, worried that they would break, and that they were curious about the presence of the picnic tables at all, given that they weren't allowed to eat lunch outside. When I was doing the walk along focus groups, there were some students at these picnic tables at both schools. Um, and I was talking to them about their impressions of the space, and that was where we had the majority of this, that's where the majority of these quotes came from. So, in terms of our adult focus groups, some main takeaways were mostly related to adults' impressions of sort of the community's role in the space. At school A, the folks who I spoke to mostly knew who in their community was using the school um, in for recreation, or so when we were doing the walk-alongs, folks were able to point out like, oh, that's my neighbor, that's my kid's parent, that's or my spouse, that's my kid's friend's parent. I know them walking their dog. Whereas at school B, when we were doing the walk along, there were folks from the neighborhood using the space, but there was not any knowledge of the relationships between the people who I was talking to and the people who are using the space. And again, like as a student also of statistics, you can't extrapolate that in these discrete conversations, this says that definitively people in the neighborhood at school A all know the folks who use the property, and whereas at school B that's not true. But I think for the purposes of these focus groups, that dialogue and that sentiment is what proliferates within the community. Like that is a generally held sentiment, at least in the sample size that I had for these schools. And so, as a program evaluator, if that is an impression that is had by a group of people using this program, then that's important information to bring back to the program administrators. But I just think it's important to distinguish between like a statistical significant difference and feedback on a program, um, any amount of which is valuable to the administrators, the latter of which is what I was able to report back. So again, at school B, the folks who we saw walking around were demographically dissimilar from the population at school B, meaning that most of the people using the space, the track after school, were white. Most of the people at the school were Hispanic. Um, in terms of usage as a park space, similarly, um, folks at school A were using the track for dog walking and sports um, areas for recreation, and as at school B, people were also walking their dogs, but they were the demographically dissimilar adults walking their dogs, who also tended to leave their dog waste behind and not clean it up. So that was a pretty outstanding point, was that people who were using the space at school B, who were not from the community or the original community, didn't there was not an understanding of respect and maintenance for the space. Um, Adults from school B generally found that the grounds, again, these swaths of unengaged land, were as unshaded spaces, were not engaging or not places that they would want to be. Um, neither focus group, neither adult focus group at either school had any knowledge of how the spaces were planned. Um, there was more knowledge of the campus architectural team on in both adult focus groups. Um, However, at school B, and the parent who was on the campus architectural team and in the focus group felt that they were not being heard or taken seriously by the administration. Um, but that overall, in both conversations, parents were really bought. And, this again also may be confirmation bias for if you sign up for a focus group about green schoolyards, you probably believe them to be pretty important. But there was a lot of base knowledge about the importance of nature for solving behavioral and academic and social problems. And so that was not a base building conversation that needed to be had. We have like 3 slides left. So overall, student-related findings, I kind of felt like at the end of this research project, I was like, oh, discovered sociology, like that socioeconomic contexts do impact policies, but that for planners, the implication for planners and for administrators at schools is that policies heavily dictate spatial interactions, that putting something in a place doesn't mean it's going to be used the way that it's supposed to be. So, particularly for me, what really stood out was the difference between transgression, whereas we're at school A, one student's transgression was not used as sort of an excuse to keep everybody inside. And so, because students were allowed to use the space more, the space was maintained, the amenities were um, well used and so replaced when needed. Whereas at school B, because outside time was kind of withdrawn as punishment, students could use the space less, so then their amenities would degrade, but because no one was using them because they weren't allowed to use them, they wouldn't get replaced. This I find aligns with racially discriminatory disciplinary policy literature. We see this disciplinary discrepancy between students in research. But overall, I saw distinct perceptions and levels of engagement with the outdoor spaces. And I would end this slide just by saying that one particular quote that stood out to me at school B was a student who said that, or she asked, if we have, what's the point of having all this wide open space if we're not allowed to use it? So the students, I think it's also important, and I think school administrators really know this, but planners, I think the emergence of youth engaged planning is fortunately on the rise, but students and youth are really receptive to what the narrative surrounding their um, capacity is for engagement. Like if you tell a student that they're not allowed to use something and that then they're gonna hear that. They're very perceptive people. So that really stood out to me. For adults, the main finding regarded usage as the park space, where again in this sort of similar self-fulfilling loop, um, adults who were at school A, who were in the neighborhood and in the school community, used the schoolyard with care and engaged the amenities. Whereas at school B, because the surrounding neighborhood residents used the schoolyard with little to no care, the adults in the school community felt frustrated and didn't use the space, and so then didn't have, and because they, as stakeholders, they didn't have um, the interest in advocating for a space that they're not going to use, there was not sort of that like um, catalyst for change. And then when there was a parent on the campus architectural team who was advocating for change and they weren't being listened to, there was this feeling of frustration. And then in terms of participatory design, like always in planning, you can always ask people and engage them more effectively about their space. It's always more, you can always do more of that. So in terms of our last slide, just overarchingly, in terms of a program evaluation, what was working in the green schoolyards was really having the outdoor learning areas that students enjoyed and did and used during campus, during the time when they were on campus. The teachers who valued being outside were really good at that and were really standout staff for these projects, and then parents' buy-in of why being outside was important. But what was really necessary is this overlay of anti-racism as it relates to disciplinary policies and not sort of withdrawing time outside to correct behavior. Um, that again, kids want to be able to play in their space, and so we should ask them what they want. And then, in order to sort of solve these problems, we need to have equity grounded conversations with stakeholders, so people who are managing these spaces. And then, what I would continue to do research on if I was still a grad student would probably be this phenomenon that is when we do improve green spaces, we do risk gentrification. So, for example, at school B, in literature, increased dog walking is a sign of increased gentrification. So if at school B we were to improve the green space and engage the students, how do we protect the existing demographic and not have the demographic change? Because now for more affluent families, that in that improved amenity is more attractive, just like we see in housing gentrification and community gentrification. So just to say that community engaged research and awareness of systemic discrimination results in more equitable planning. Obviously, this is super ideal. Again, a year ago, this was ideal research. In 2026, this is mega ideal research, ideal recommendations. But nevertheless, that's what I came to. So I'm going to stop sharing. That's the end of my presentation, and happy to open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Janice. Great job. And we already have a question in the chat for you.
Great.
So Renee asks, curious, did your assessment include looking at accessibility for people with disabilities, different abilities, neurodivergence? Do you know if students in focus groups represented those with IEPs or 504 plans? And if not, are you aware of work on this locally?
Yeah, this is a great question. So again, these focus groups were not ideal samples in that they did not cover every aspect of demographic in these schools. So the focus groups did not contain, I mean, there may have been people with IEPs in those groups. I wouldn't know. Um, I think I'm going to take two routes to answer your question. Um, Accessibility of green space, and so universal design as it relates to like putting amenities in this case, schoolyards that are accessible. Um, Similarly to outdoor learning is also in the education specifications for AISD. So it is a priority. That would be another very interesting and important evaluation is accessibility for people with physical and intellectual disabilities. Um, I think that universal design, advocacy for universal design does exist. I'm not aware of like any resources off the top of my head specific to green schoolyards and universal design, but in planning, generally speaking, universal design, if it's accessible to people with the full spectrum of disability, it's accessible to everyone. That's generally the line of thinking that goes along with that. But again, that this program evaluation did not specify accessibility um, as its sort of main scope. But I will say that one of the people in the adult focus group at School B in East Austin had students who did have IEPs and was an advocate for students with intellectual and physical disabilities. And they talked specifically about how the space at their school was very unengaging, boring for students with disabilities, but that they took them out there a lot, but there was no shade and there was not the opportunity for engagement. So that was sort of the parents' main bent at these campus architectural teams was like, there's a great opportunity here to make engaging outdoor spaces for students with disabilities who tend to be taken outside the most because of the opportunities within their curriculum. So that was a priority, but again, like the parent didn't feel like that was being really picked up by the administration in those meetings. So I think I would just end by saying, like, yeah, making green spaces more accessible to everyone can only help everyone. And they have a an important role for students with disabilities, especially given the health benefits for everyone. But engaging outdoor areas for students with disabilities is especially important. I hope that answers your question.
And we have a note from Yasmin. I'm a parent of a high school student in Austin ISD that has an IEP, and I'm not aware of any focus groups. They're engaging students with neuro differences. So.
I can speak to that just a little bit, just quickly to say that my daughter is 15 and she's had an IEP since she was 7. And because of my privilege and the way I know how to work the system, I was able to provide the education, the public education that she needs by knowing which schools were going to have outdoor time, which schools were project-based learning, um, and have taken on as her like a role as her advocate, essentially, which, you know, is still somewhat of a part-time job, ensuring that I know her IEP inside and out, ensuring that I know the people at the school, ensuring that she is now learning to advocate for herself and that it is not readily available to many parents to have those resources, especially parents and guardians of students in the Title I schools. Those things are not easily available or understandable.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. And thank you for this note also, Yasmin, about HB6 and the removal of students, the ease with which staff can withdraw students from the classroom. And this probably does relate to privileges as well, or at least if there is outdoor learning happening, it would extend to that also. Um, I'm reading your comment, Renee. Developmental pediatrician, 10%. Um, I think I would just say, Renee, that any advocacy from a medical professional about the benefit of going outside is always very powerful, especially because it's generally pretty well regarded as sort of a harmless intervention, um, at least in conversations that I have had. It does seem to be a pretty bipartisanly friendly subject, is going outside. So I think that that might be a good opportunity. Does anyone else have any questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat, Sarah.
While folks are thinking about a question, I'll put our evaluation in the chat. So please take a minute to fill out our evaluation. That helps us plan future webinars and share with Janice. Um, you did a great job. As I'm currently writing a grant for Green Schoolyards, but for a
Great,
different school district.
great.
That I was going through it, I was like, I need to put all of this into our language for the grant
Good.
application.
Yay.
So,
I'm gonna drop the advocacy materials in the chat that and Renee, this may be helpful just to sort of review. Yes, important to document. Yeah, I think the what I am, I think as a planner, as a student of planning and of policy at in this particular at that juncture in my life, I think um, creating recommendations for the school district and for the parks department was sort of the priority of this project. But I am glad to have this documentation. Um, and to sort of continue bringing qualitative program evaluation into my professional career, my burgeoning professional career. Um, so, um, I see that Yasmin has put an important comment in, that is that AISD has a couple advisory bodies that could be helpful. Um, cool. Sarah, did you want to?
well, I'll just share our next webinar is also great for those of you working in green schoolyards, and it's how to plan, plant, and care for native trees,
Awesome.
which I know is always a challenge for many of our school districts. Especially they'll be gifted trees sometimes, and then not necessarily know how to take care of them. So if you want to register for that, it's Saturday and it's with Emmy, who's our amazing intern this semester. And so she's giving a workshop on that. And Yasmin has her hand up, so I'm gonna let her jump in.
Um, I gotta come off
Yeah.
I have to show my face because it's just weird to not.
Mhm.
I just wanted to add just another layer to this that's due to the current climate that we're in, which is that the schools that are in our most under-resourced areas are also dealing with a heightened risk and fear due to
Mhm.
immigration enforcement. And so on top of the other barriers that are, constantly prevalent with just systemic racism in our policies, there
Mhm.
is now an extra layer of fear for educators taking these students outdoors,
Yep.
as well as parents taking their students to the park. I have had a relationship with a very amazing park adopter for the last 3 years. I'm getting emotional because it's really hard. I just talked to her last week. And champion of our community um, in one of these spaces and can no longer enjoy the outdoors and can no longer allow her children to enjoy the outdoors the way they once did, which has in turn caused the beautiful community that she built at that park to also remain inside. So it's just a little extra layer of crap on top of something that's already so incredibly hard. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's awareness. It's something that I am thinking about right now as I am asking folks to volunteer in parks, to
Mhm.
steward parks, to really just be mindful because we don't know what we don't know, and everyone has to assess their risk.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Yeah, and I think, in terms of in the ideal world, what would be great is if students who have a heightened risk right now are able to use these spaces outside, you know, during times when um things are challenging, student teachers worry about taking students outside. But if there are, in these outdoor learning areas tend to be very, especially at these schools that I visited, are enclosed within the campus. It is very clear that these outdoor learning areas are for students in the school. So in an ideal world, students can go use these outdoor areas when they're able to without fear of retribution. So um, if things were working better in the systems that are supposed to support students during these times of crisis, that would be great. And I did not see that statement relevant to this subject put out by the Academy of Pediatrics, but it would be really, really great to be able to put it in the chat, Renee.
Yeah, and Renee,
Yes.
yeah, if you can't find it before we head off, if you want to email it to me, I'll put it in the follow-up email.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you, Renee. Cool.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Janice, it's always a pleasure to get to see
Yes.
you.
So good to see you. If anyone's in Boston, let me know. So good to see you, Yasmin. I'll catch up with
And,
you soon.
and if anyone has an urban planning
Thanks.
job for Janice, also let her know.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep going. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Sarah.